Hey, what's up, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I want to talk about something that affects every one of us, and I need to lay it out as the foundation for some videos I have planned for the future. What I will do today is I will unpack the relationship between our DNA, our environment, and our actions. This topic that I'm going to get into may be challenging for some people to kind of process or maybe even accept, but that's not everybody. And also, I don't mean to say that in a disrespectful, slightful, or otherwise dismissive manner. I'm not here to disrespect anyone. I just want to manage expectations for this video so you will actively listen all the way to the end. My intention is to start a conversation and raise awareness that how we view, judge, and deal with each other needs to change. I'm going to need your compassion and your love for humanity, or at least your philosophical curiosity to come out and play for this one, okay? So, as a reminder, these are my thoughts. I am not a psychologist. I am not a sociologist. I'm simply an engineer. And if you want to hop into the comments and have constructive conversation, that's all great. But anything that is intentionally rude or disrespectful or otherwise instigative, please don't bring that anywhere near my video or my audio, and I won't tolerate it. Your comment will be disappeared. This is a 100% respect zone, and I enthusiastically encourage constructive discourse so that we can make workable solutions out of the ideas I discussed today. So let's get into the basics of what I really wanted to unpack. We're going to talk a little bit about accountability and perception of people's actions. We live in a world where people are held accountable for their decisions. Some are labeled as criminals, others as victims of circumstance. For instance, we take drug addiction as an example. We already know they've done a 180 in society on the narrative regarding opioid use versus crack use. Nevertheless, many still see these drug addictions as personal failures of that person. But is it really that simple? There's actually a spectrum between willful malicious intent and actions born out of ignorance, desperation, or circumstances beyond the person's control. In America, specifically in America, our criminal justice system reflects this tension. On one hand, we claim to have correctional institutions designed to reform with an expectation that once released, people are supposed to be well behaved. But in reality, they often serve to isolate, punish, and mentally destroy and permanently brand individuals as outcasts. Rarely and begrudgingly do our judges and laws consider the mental, physical, and environmental factors that lead to someone committing a crime. And when people do re-enter society, they face an uphill battle against stigma and systemic barriers, making reintegration nearly impossible. Now, why is that? Because we assume everyone has the same starting point and the same opportunities to choose differently, as we say. But let's challenge that assumption today. Are our actions truly autonomous, or are they shaped by forces beyond our control? I would say that there are three forces that shape us. Every human being is a product of three things: their DNA, the biological blueprint we inherit. We have zero control over what we're given in that way. The environment, that is the external conditions and experiences we encounter. Initially, we have zero control over that as well. But as we get older, we're given increasing sovereignty to change where we are and what we're around. But we can only change to what we know is available to be changed to, or what we have access to. So there are limitations there as well. And then three, our actions, the decisions we make, which are often seen as the ultimate expression of our autonomy. But here's the catch. These decisions or those actions are themselves shaped by the aforementioned DNA and environment. We only make actions or take actions that we can think of and that we believe we can actually do somehow. which again are products of what we know and what we feel and what we've encountered. So let me explain with an analogy. Imagine life as a maze. You didn't choose to enter the maze and you didn't design it. Your DNA determines some fundamental things in this. It determines your height, your temperament, your color and activity preferences, your talents, and your basic instincts. Your environment determines the layout of the maze, that is the walls, the paths, and even if you're given a map or left blindly to just wander. When you make a decision in this scenario, inside of this maze, it's based on the options you perceive and the tools you've been given. Now, yes, you could break down walls, but only if you know to even think the walls can be broken. There's a concept of breaking through things. There's a concept of walls. These things have to be understood before you can start to combine them and say you're going to break through the wall or break it down. Or you at least have to even have the perception to dream up such a notion and try it out, right? And even then, you need the right tools and the belief that it's possible before you'll take the action in most cases. These are not guaranteed things that everybody will have. Now, how is that so? Well, let's go from cradle to grave. Let's go from babies to builders. Taking it back to the basics. A baby, a newborn, is born with a minimal set of instincts. The ability to suckle, cry, laugh, react to stimuli. Everything else, like walking, talking, creating things. These notions come from environmental inputs. Parents, teachers, peers. Everything provides experiences, information, and other inputs, which shape how a child understands navigation of the world. Without those inputs, a child's development would be stunted. We all know this. This is well studied and understood. Now, extend that ideal to an older child who learns to settle disputes with a gun. That knowledge and behavior doesn't appear in a vacuum. That's a result of exposure and DNA. On the exposure side, we have exposure to a gun, to a concept that disagreement is disrespect, to the value system or a value system that condones violence, and a disregard for the law. From a DNA side, you could have a higher tolerance of blood and gore, less tolerance for disrespect, and higher emotional volatility. The DNA side, honestly, is really a chemistry kind of spectrum. And when you take on this spectrum, there's infinite points along the spectrum a person could be at. So it may not be as strong or more prominent in some people versus others. But when you take the environment and your DNA together in one person, there you go. You have a combination, and you can now see how these things that I just mentioned can lead someone from A to Z. And then the only decision that they eventually make was to pull the trigger of the gun. But if you even think about it, even that trigger pull was a foregone conclusion, given that all the factors we threw in there really led us to basically what was nearly an inevitable outcome. Now, let's take that and extend it into an adult who's in their 40s and has substantial credit card debt. Again, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. Presuming that it was simply someone making excessive purchases which were above and beyond their means and were totally outside of their needs. That situation, again, is a result of exposure and DNA. On the exposure side, a consumerism normalized environment, that means normalizing consumption of goods that are unnecessary. A credit normalized environment, that is extending yourself even temporarily to make said purchases. A debt normalized environment, that is actually going into debt over these purchases. A value system that doesn't include financial conservatism, that is living below your means. And of course, a final motivation for having things that you don't already have. So take all those things from an environmental impact or an environmental standpoint, and then you look at the DNA side. where you could perhaps have an inflated self of self, a sense of self that this person may develop over time that could in fact make them believe they could pay it off sooner than later by some grandiose side hustle scheme they haven't even started. These things serve as psychological enablers. And of course, that motivator ultimately that moves them forward to swiping that card would be a culture of instant gratification of some sort. And you see it proliferate around them and in society. So it is not really that much wonder that it continues to grow. So now you can see how these things can lead a person from A to Z. And then the only key decision that they eventually make is to swipe their card repeatedly. But even if you think about it even deeper in that same way, that swipe was a foregone conclusion. Those repeated swipes of the credit card were foregone conclusions, given that all the factors we had in this scenario were thrown into the bucket. It's basically a recipe. As we say, in some cases, a recipe for disaster. Now, for those who are already getting antsy and jumping up and down in their seats, I want to be very clear. This does not excuse accountability. This does not exclude accountability. Accountability is ownership of the results of one's actions. And if one still says, it's my debt and I'll pay it off, they actually maintain accountability and take ownership of their actions and its consequences, albeit not the most economical way to live, but that is not writing off responsibility, and therefore it is still accountability, and they still hold that if they are going to pay it off. If one does their time in jail rather than even attempting to run from the police, especially if they even admit their guilt in court of law, they again maintain accountability and take ownership of their action and its consequences, despite the external factors that made these outcomes nearly foregone conclusions. So understand that this is different. What I'm speaking to is not about how responsibility and accountability are accepted and maintained and fulfilled. I'm talking about how these sorts of scenarios come about to begin with. The point is, people act on what they feel and what they do and don't know. What they feel usually starts with DNA in terms of their predisposed deterministic factors about their character and their personality. And what they do and don't know is usually a result of their environment, the things they've been exposed to. And further complicating it is that environment can change DNA over time, and how one feels can be manipulated by their environment over time. Even creativity, for example, often seen as the ultimate individual trait, creativity. Oh, you're so creative, you're just amazing with your creativity. Creativity is a product of DNA and, to a lesser extent, environment. And what does creativity really breed? It breeds solutions to problems. Well, so if I'm an engineer, so let's think about patents, right? Let's talk about patents. To be awarded a patent, you actually must have an invention that's truly unique. You have to come up with something that's truly unique. But even that unique invention itself while it is and must be a thing that is non-obvious to a person skilled in that art, it still is undoubtedly built through one's accrued awareness of the prior arts and inventions of the past. That is the accumulated knowledge and collective information and tools in that field of art. Similarly, our actions and ideas are shaped by everything that came before that moment that we had that idea or took that action. That includes how you even arrived at this video. Even motivation is a product of our DNA and environment. You don't choose to be motivated by any particular action or outcome. You don't choose what motivates you. You are either motivated or you're not by what you're exposed to. So then people come to me and they say, well, Darville, what about discipline? How about discipline? What about that? What about people forcing themselves to do the right thing in a systemic manner? How does that come into play? Because, motivation is one thing, but discipline is what we all need, right? What's interesting about this is I want you to guess. You still must be motivated to employ discipline, And honestly, discipline is a motivated systemic practice of something with an acceptance of delayed gratification based on the belief you will eventually get the thing you are motivated so much to get that you've employed discipline as a means to get it. So you still require motivation toward the goal at hand to employ discipline. Heck, even dope dealers have motivation and employ discipline in aspects of their lives if necessary to realize a goal. Discipline is an intermediary tool. You can't out-discipline motivation. You can't be motivated towards something you don't value, and you didn't create your values in a vacuum. See how all these things keep coming from the past to the present? All roads lead to the current moment. Let's also address the fallacy of equal opportunity. Layman's society likes to assume that people who commit the same crime had the same opportunities to avoid it. But that isn't necessarily true. That's actually rarely true. For example, two people might steal out of necessity, but one grew up in poverty while the other didn't. Their final choices may look the same, but the paths that led them there were drastically different. One could have a family to turn to, but be too ashamed. Another could have no one to turn to at all. You could argue both of these are not situations of necessity because, of course, a lot of you will try to pull some bull out of your pocket, your hat, your underwear about what they could or should have done. But they're not you and you're not them. And who are you to argue what necessity is in the shoes of another person? This is why laws don't and honestly can't prevent crime. They only set boundaries. They're a tool for justifying punishment, not for understanding or addressing the root causes of behavior. By ignoring the influence of DNA in the environment, we've created a system that punishes outcomes and outputs without addressing the inputs. Therefore, these issues repeat themselves both on the individual and societal levels, and people become resentful and indignant toward greater society, institutions, social norms, and the like, because they see the inequity about how these things perceive and treat them without regards for their actual individuality. We seem to never want to address or confront the inputs. It's so much easier to leave society to repeat itself and cry about the outcome later, with emotional retaliation becoming codified into law with an increasing level of vengeance. So we've long acknowledged that childhood is critical, these formative years. They drastically influence a person's trajectory, right? But even as adults, our thoughts, values, ideas, and decisions are shaped by things we've encountered. As the great Yvette Carnell has often said, you are only as smart as the ideas you've bumped up against. So I take her saying, and I extrapolate that into this situation to hold that variations, differences, and even disparities in upbringing, education, and exposure, I mean from childhood through all the way to you die, adulthood included, lead to vastly different outcomes, even for siblings in the same household as children and adolescents. Moreover, I will hold that DNA dictates how we process those experiences, further amplifying differences in outputs. One child might thrive in a structured environment, while another rebels against it. Neither child's response was a choice. That's why corporal punishment was so much of a big deal and in many people's minds constructively effective, because it put so much fear into the child that it reshaped their otherwise natural tendencies as they self-regulated to preserve themselves from bodily harm by their parent. You exploit part of their inherent DNA-driven nature of self-protection to curtail other parts of their same DNA-driven and environmentally developed behaviors. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. Yet still, their behavior didn't come about in a vacuum. In fact, it's more of a product of the DNA and environment given to them by the same parents who are punishing them. So what's the path forward? The path forward is truth, compassion, and going to the core. We're left with, I would call, profound responsibility that has been neglected, but it's a profound responsibility to reconsider how we judge others, including personality, character, actions, and so forth. Listen, we also need to include society as a whole in considering how it's been assembled into its current form, from the best to the worst. If we understand that all these things are products of DNA and environment, we can't simplistically treat individual people as either good or bad. People are people, but people are products of things that came before them and many things that are outside of their control. That's how you have so many variations of types of people. And that's also why we need more compassion, because no one chose who they would become. And that's another hard thing for people to accept. Like, even the most successful people in the world did not actively say, I'm going to be the most successful person in the world out of a vacuum. They chose that because that's what they were trending toward before they were even able to say their first words, before they even realized what they were going to finally do with their lives. Before they were an adult, they were trending towards it because the inputs that went into them they didn't have control over made the most formative impact on what they would end up doing. People are people. They're very moldable. We can see their personality, character, actions, and so forth as either constructive or problematic, but we must remember they rarely invent any of this themselves. And had they not been exposed to certain things, they wouldn't do certain things, and certain outcomes wouldn't have come about, whether they be good or bad. We are not self-made. You might as well call us NPCs. Now, who are you to be an NPC yourself mad at another NPC? That sounds like a degenerate artificial intelligence robot. That sounds like, bot behavior. So, again, this isn't about absolving personal responsibility or accountability. It's about recognizing that responsibility exists within a context, and that by addressing that context, we can create a society that truly exhibits dignified and equitable growth, fairness, and individuality. But we should also see that the lack of, and sometimes unwillingness to, address those contexts is in and of itself another problematic characteristic of the society and individuals within it, which both stem from a cycle of DNA and environment, which we refuse to address. So, kind of landing the plane in closing, the next time you hear someone say, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, or any variation thereof, right? Because they keep varying that phraseology, like I spoke about earlier, being self-made. Remember this. They had boots. They had straps. They had the physical ability to pull themselves. And they had just enough information and perception to fashion all those things together to move themselves forward. Not everyone has all of those things, let alone at the same quality or the same time. That is not to say these things don't exist. That means you have to actually know they exist, perceive, gather them, and use them in a way that will create a better future for yourself or to change an outcome. And I know this to be true because of the example I gave you about patents. I'm going to say at least 50% of patents that come about are built on prior art and existing inventions, in the sense that these things are not included as part of the invention that's being submitted as far as, the invention itself, but the technology that created those prior inventions and prior art is understood and is in a way implicated in the creation of this new invention. We're all products of forces beyond our control, but that doesn't mean we're individually or collectively unaccountable or powerless. But by understanding and confronting the truth about the maze we're really in, we can help both ourselves and others break down walls, unlocking growth, innovation, and more fulfillment and happiness across society and not just a select few. This is nothing new what I'm saying right now, but what it means is we have to dramatically increase our compassion for one another and deviate from the patterns of the past to work issues at their roots, at the core, and not at the limbs. If history has said anything over and over, it's that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that's because the underlying core aspects are not being addressed. We just keep putting on new window dressings. It's a vicious cycle that keeps repeating, but there's definitely hope. And I want to engage and encourage people who have hope and vision that the real core work can be done to come out, band together, and help move us forward. We don't need naysayers. We don't need naysayers who are vested in accepting dysfunction. But what's interesting about those same naysayers who are vested in accepting dysfunction is that a lot of them eat and grow wealthy off of other people's dysfunction. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, stay dilated and compassionate.